So I have to begin today's message with a question. When was the last time you heard a sermon about hell? If you would, just raise your hand if this describes you. Has it been more than a year since you heard a sermon about hell? Has it been more than 2 years? More than 5 years? Is there any of you out there that have never heard a sermon about hell? Okay, no. Well, today, regardless of how long it's been for you, depending on how you look at it, I have either some good news or some bad news, because today I'm going to be talking about hell. As your pastor, part of my job here is to be what's called the resident theologian. And what that means is I'm supposed to teach Christian doctrine. And that's what I'm going to do today. So this message is going to be part teaching and part sermon, part application. Now, when you guys think about hell, what are the first things that come to your mind? What do you see? Do you see, say pits of fire, boiling cauldrons, demons with pitchforks torturing people? When I think about hell, believe it or not, the first thing that comes to my mind is a play. In 1943, the famous French philosopher and atheist Jean-Paul Sartre wrote this sarcastic play about his vision of what hell would be like if it actually existed. And the play was called No Exit. Now in it, these three damned souls are brought to the same room. They're locked in by this mysterious valet. And it's actually a nice room. It's like a drawing room in the Victorian era style. It's fully furnished, fully decorated. And so as the characters, as they struggle to figure out why they're in hell and how they'll be punished, they quickly gather that there is no torturer. There's no flames to burn their souls eternally. It's just the three of them trapped in this deadlock. So they try to be friends with each other. That doesn't work. They try to come on to each other romantically, and that doesn't work. They try to ignore each other, and that doesn't work. And then they think maybe they were supposed to torture each other, so they try to kill each other. But the thing is, they're already dead. They're in hell, so that doesn't work either. So talk about a bad situation. And then they all realize they've been placed in hell to make each other miserable. So the eternal torture and punishment of this room in hell is each other's company. And thus, Sartre ends the play with this famous line. He says, "So this is hell. I'd have never believed it. You remember all we were told about the torture chambers, the fire and brimstone? Old wives' tales. There's no need for red-hot pokers because hell is other people." So at a glance, you might think that that's kind of funny. In fact, you might even be thinking, wow, that sounds kind of true. There might be a lot of people that you wouldn't want to be locked in a room with for all eternity. I know I can think of a few myself. But you know what? It's it's actually not a joke. What he's actually doing here is making this bleak philosophical statement about human nature. So Sartre is using this metaphor of something that he obviously doesn't even believe in to illustrate the challenge of human relationships. So he's saying that the presence of other people locks us into a particular mode of being and that it impedes our freedom. So he's promoting a kind of radical individualism that says, I can't really be what I'm meant to be because I'm limited by all the other people and the culture around me. So only in isolation can we be a free and true self. So this is a very grim worldview, make no mistake. And so this is what I think of when I think of hell. I can never quite get that dark vision out of my head. And I'm sure whatever visualizations you guys have, I'm sure they're equally as grim. And I wouldn't doubt that one of the reasons we have all these dark and gruesome visions of hell in our minds is simply because we just don't talk about it that much. It's become sort of like a taboo subject. But then here's Jesus just punching us in the face with it. I mean, we really can't avoid it here, can we? He goes from being this nice, friendly, domesticated, and safe Jesus with the children sitting in his lap to, well, kind of sounding like Marlon Brando from The Godfather. If you cause these little ones to stumble, you're going to be sleeping with the fishes. If you're going to sin, it's better to gouge your eyes out and cut your hands and feet off because you're going to end up in the fires of hell. So how's that for an offer you can't refuse? And even if we don't like to talk about hell in the pulpits today, believe me, this wasn't always the case. In our past, there were many, many hellfire and damnation preachers, and one of the most famous was Jonathan Edwards. Have any of you guys ever heard of him? Maybe not, but he would be like the Al Pacino to Marlon Brando. He was a brilliant man. He was a theologian and pastor in the 1700s. He became the president of Princeton University. He was the true father of the Great Awakening in America, and he influenced a lot of the founding fathers, people like Thomas Jefferson. But his most famous sermon was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Now, I'm going to read an excerpt from this sermon, and I'm going to even try to get into character a little bit. And I want all of you to listen as if you were in the pews, and he's towering above you in his black pulpit robe. And Scott, maybe you might want to crank up the heat back there for some added effect. So here we go. This is Jonathan Edwards at his finest. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire, and he looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent in ours. You have offended him infinitely more than ever, yet it is nothing but God's hand that holds you from falling into the fire every single moment. Wow. So how does that make you feel? This was very common back then, and you still hear it today. I mean, if you do a quick Google search on sermons about hell, you'll find quite a few floating around out there that probably would make Jonathan Edwards proud. The idea of hell as this violent place of eternal torture where this angry, vengeful God happily sends people who don't get their lives right and who flunked their theology exams, it's still quite prevalent today. And so, as a teaching pastor and as your resident theologian, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to take a little bit of a risk today. Some of the things I might say here you may disagree with, and that's fine. I'm not infallible. I'm just going to be giving my opinions and asking some questions. And I just want us all to be asking questions. But just for the record, I have to say this for the record, everything I'm about to say has been scrutinized with a fine-tooth comb by other experts in the field, theology professors, other pastors, all through the years. So it's all been read before. But so having said that, what if I told you that this idea of hell as being a lake of fire and a place of eternal torture was actually an invention of the church in the Middle Ages? See, in the early church, after the last of the apostles had died out, there was endless debate about what hell was. Some theologians, like Athanasius, argued for a view called annihilationism. Now, with that view, God is seen as being the source of all life. Everything that lives draws its being from God. So when we move towards God by living a life of faith, we move towards life and eternal life. But on the other side of that coin, if we live after self and after ego, we're moving towards death and non-being. So in other words, as the great C.S. Lewis put it, you achieve your own ultimate ends. God gives you over to whatever it is that you truly desire, eternal life or eternal death and non-being. And then other theologians like Origen taught that hell was a place of punishment, but he likened it to iron being refined in the fire. You end up in hell to be cleansed and to be purged. So suffering isn't permanent. It's temporary. It's qualitative, not quantitative. You do your time, sort of like you're in jail, and then you're ultimately redeemed, and then you're set free. And he believed that everyone would be redeemed in the end. And he was what you would call a universalist today. So if you study church history and historical theology like I do, I am a geek, you'll see that this topic of hell was debated about for centuries. It wasn't settled. But then we hit the Middle Ages. And I don't mean to criticize or condemn our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters. Let me make that clear. It was a different time and a different world in those days. But the reality is, hell was big business. They were building the Vatican and all these expensive cathedrals all over Christendom. They had to pay for it somehow, right? And then in addition to that, having the power to promise heaven or hell, it gave them a lot of worldly power and influence too. So they took Origen's idea of a temporary punishment, and they basically turned it into what is now known as purgatory, this sort of in-between place. Now, if your dead relative was in purgatory, their eternal souls were hanging in the balance. You know, if the priests didn't pray for them to go into heaven, they would end up sliding into hell. And so the selling of indulgences was born. You literally pay a priest to pray a soul out of purgatory to prevent them from falling into some kind of eternal punishment. And so it was these kind of crooked practices that led to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. So to make a long story short, the idea of lost souls roasting in boiling cauldrons as the demons laugh and poke at them with pitchforks didn't really exist as the one and only view of hell until the Middle Ages. And this brief history lesson, then, it leads us to our text. You might look at this and say, well, it's right here. This is the smoking gun. It makes us uncomfortable, so we avoid talking about this passage. But here's the thing, and this might be surprising to some of you, but he's using hyperbole. This is like a parable, a dark and gruesome parable to be sure, but a parable nonetheless. And what's even more interesting is the fact that the original Greek translation of this text doesn't use the word hell at all. That came later, much later. The original word that is used here in this text is Gehenna. And Gehenna was a real place just outside the city walls of Jerusalem. Now, in Old Testament times, it was a place where pagan rulers and the lapsed kings of Judah made human sacrifices. The book of Jeremiah says the land itself was cursed. And then in Jesus' day, we fast forward, it was literally a garbage dump. People from Jerusalem would take their trash out there and they would burn it. So day and night, these trash fires would be burning. Truly an unquenchable fire. And so what Jesus is saying here is if you're living contrary to the will of God, you're going to end up in the garbage dump like a piece of burning trash. So in sum, am I saying that hell doesn't exist? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that if it does exist, we really don't know what it looks like. We don't know what it is. We don't know what's going on there. We don't know who is or who isn't there. And in this passage, you'll carefully note how he's talking about the fate of believers, not unbelievers. So in my opinion, and my opinion alone, it's just useless to speculate about it. You know, sometimes I don't know is actually the most sound theological answer. And that's where I think we should leave it. You know, so if some skeptic that challenges you about your beliefs, and they say, well, you say that your God is all loving, but what about all those people that are roasting in eternal hellfire? What if we just told them, I don't know. I don't know if that's what really happens. You could show them this sermon if you like, as Exhibit A, and then shift the conversation to what's actually important, which is what Jesus himself does here. We don't know what hell is or isn't, but what we do know is how we can change in this life right here and right now. Jesus wants us to change, and he wants us to change urgently. That's the point of the stark language that he uses in this parable. The theologian Dan Migliore, he describes hell like this. He says, hell is simply wanting to be oneself apart from God's grace and in isolation from others. Hell is self-destructive resistance to the eternal love of God. And so here we are, my friends. We are back full circle to my vision of hell. John Paul Sartre's play, No Exit, and the idea that hell is other people. Hell is that idea precisely. As Migliore says, hell is human beings in isolation from God and from one another. So Sartre was dead wrong. Hell isn't other people, it's rejecting and excluding other people. It's the rejection of community and the human need to live in interdependence with one another. That's what Jesus is talking about here. The disciples, they reject this other exorcist because he's not following their ways. He's not following the lead of the disciples. They want to draw this small circle. You're either in or you're out. And so they fall into the trap that snares so many religious groups all throughout history. They want to restrict salvation to their group and their group alone. Jesus is saying, this isn't it. This isn't how you live. This is how you end up in the garbage dump. So in the harshest language possible, he's saying to them, widen the circle, guys. Learn to live in greater unity in spite of your differences. And this exorcist, he may pray differently than you do. He may dress differently than you do, but he's still your brother. So widen the circle. People are going to come to you. They're going to come to us. They're going to be looking for guidance and spiritual leadership. And nothing will prevent their spiritual development more than the unquenchable fires of exclusivity and rejection. Don't do this, Jesus says. Show them hospitality. Give them a cold cup of water. So let me leave you with this. We don't know what hell is. We don't know what it isn't. We don't know what it looks like, but we know that we'll end up in the proverbial garbage dump when we shrink the circle. So Jesus ends the parable by talking about being salt. And back then they had a saying, the world cannot survive without salt. And it was a reminder that salt was necessary in the ancient world because back then it was used to preserve food from rotting. So Jesus is encouraging them and us to be salt, to have a positive and preserving influence in a decaying world where hell is other people. He wants us to bring flavor back to life and to make this world thirst for Him. and his love. So as we leave this sanctuary, let's take down our own personal no exit signs, and let's welcome being in the spiritual drawing room with people who aren't like us. Let's be open, let's be accepting, and let's be tolerant of all. And let's amputate the bad habits and ideas that will weigh down our witness to this world. And finally, let's embrace the salt of the sacrificial life and love of our Lord so that we can be salt to a world that's stuck in its own drawing room where there is no exit. Thanks be to God. Amen.